The idea of a classic implies something that has continuance and consistency and which produces unity and tradition, fashions and transmits itself and endures. A true classic, as I should like to hear it defined, is an author who has enriched the human mind, increased its treasure, and caused it to advance a step, who has discovered some moral and not equivocal truth or revealed some internal passion in that heart where all seemed known and discovered, who has expressed his thought, observation, or invention, in no matter what form, only provided it be broad and great, refined and sensible, sane and beautiful in itself, who has spoken to all in his own peculiar style, a style which is found to be also that of the whole world, a style new, without neologism, new and old, easily contemporary with all time. Hello, welcome. The quote I just read is but one opinion on what a classic actually is. And while I do agree with our esteemed French gentleman that wrote it, even though I don't like French people, we do have to acknowledge he's a failed author, but a very successful literary critic. And if that says something about you, does it? And if it does, what does it say? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is, that's just one opinion. So, what is a classic? I don't even think you can see that, but it's important that it's there. Also, wait, look. I'm on air now, gentlemen. Of course, there are really multiple different interpretations of what a classic actually is. You have like the classical understanding. That's not the right term. There is an understanding that something from the classical era, which would be like 500 BCE or BC to 400 AD or 500 AD, just to make it a nice round 1,000 years. That's like the classical era in Greek and Roman cultures, the Greco-Roman culture even, if you will. Anything produced in that time period is a classic. That's not a definition that people normally think of when you're like, wow, Crime and Punishment is such a classic. Obviously, Dostoevsky was Russian. To the bathroom now. Another interpretation is that a classic is, it's a work of art, right? It's still literature or still prose or poetry or whatever. But more importantly, it also draws themes from philosophy, mythology, theology, all the ologies. And essentially, because it relies on these different cultural understandings of like spiritual topics, things to do with like legends and myths and gods and how they interact with you and what that means for you, that determines what a classic is. There's like a little quote by T.S. Eliot where he's like, the difference between Dante and Blake is like, Dante was relying on all of these things, and this other like well-known poet, like he wrote great poetry, but it's not literature because it's not continuing on a tradition. It's obviously, Dante was still doing something new with what he wrote. Of course, he was very angry at all those Medici noblemen or whatever. He was doing something new, but he's still continuing a tradition of the Bible, really. A classic can also be a classic or considered a classic when it is published for a long time, when it has great longevity. Think of The Odyssey by Homer. I don't know. Obviously, publishing has only been around as long as the publishing press, but it's been in print. People have been writing about it, reading it, talking about it for since we've had like pencils and paper, basically, like Romans were learning about the Odyssey. Greeks, obviously, were learning about the Odyssey and the Iliad. The Odyssey's better. And I'll die on that hill, even though you can't really say something's better than the other, but I will. So longevity, right? But even think about like probably one of the more recent classics, at least that I've read, is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, something Heller. Nice lad, I'm sure. But again, that's very, very recent. That was written in 1963. So if you think about it, that's not even 100 years. That's like, somewhere in the ballpark of 60-something years, right? So, 60 years, that can be like a whole lifetime for some people, multiple lifetimes for other people, but still it doesn't really seem like that long of a time period. To be considered a classic, only 60 years, I'm sure there have been some books that have been in print that long that we don't consider a classic. So I don't think longevity is personally what determines a classic, not just longevity, right? Not just being in print. Furthermore, a classic can be a book that everyone wants to read or understands that they should read, or is in like the cultural zeitgeist. You know, like if I refer to like the Ninth Circle of Hell, like going back to Dante, most people, I don't know how many people, but I would say a majority of people would know what I'm referring to. They're like, oh, I've at least heard of it, even if I don't know what it comes from. So that is kind of just proving a piece of literature's merit, basically, by being in the cultural zeitgeist. Now, this doesn't apply to like something like Game of Thrones has obviously been in the cultural zeitgeist. Well, not anymore, but it used to be, and I don't think that would be considered a classic just because people are talking about it, and you know, a lot of people would know what you're referring to if you're talking about like, I haven't read the series yet, I don't know. or watch the show. I have them. I need to read them. I don't need to do anything actually, but I want to. I don't know even what you refer to. Jon Snow. People would be like, Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. That doesn't mean that Game of Thrones is going to be in print, 60 years later and still have cultural relevancy, and people are going to know what you're talking about when you're like, wow, this is something Jon Snow would do. Whip out my sword. I really like having this camera, by the way. It makes me feel like I can move around. Jon Snow moment. The last major interpretation of what a classic is, and of course I'm an objective source, so I'm only delivering to you true information. Obviously, there are different interpretations of what a classic is. I'm not going to cover them all because, well, simply, I don't want to, and I don't think it's very important, and we'll get to that later. And by later, I mean like in a couple minutes. We're going to finish this first. So, finally, a classic is a classic because it's being studied and analyzed. So basically, you're saying, well, if they're reading it at Harvard in a literature class, that means it's a classic, which isn't an actual definition of what a classic is. It is more so just, it's not moving the goalpost per se, because that's not what that means. It's you're putting the burden on someone else to decide what a classic is. So then Harvard has to decide what a classic is and isn't, and they have certain criteria and certain standards. They might even use some of these that I mentioned previously, but that's not a definition of what a classic is. I would say anyone who says that would not go and then say that the Hungry Caterpillar is a classic just because, Harvard puts it in their book list or something like that. Actually, the Hungry Caterpillar is a classic. We'll get into that later. Okay, so my thoughts, or the conclusion. Well, let's just read this conclusion that I've written. It's pretty nice. So, to conclude and summarize all of these points, these different opinions, into a generalized statement, a classic is a classic if it has had a long-standing cultural relevance, B, has an original idea, or a rework or retelling of an older idea, because you can think of, like, I guess we'll go back to the Inferno. Obviously, Dante had a lot of original ideas, but he's still drawing from a shared pool of cultural ideas of, what hell is like. Like, he didn't invent hell being, this torturous place of ice and fire, I actually don't know if he invented, like, the circles or not. I don't know if that was already a thing. I haven't looked into it too much. Also, it has to have been around long enough to prove its relevancy, to prove it's not just a fad. So, again, like, going back to, like, Game of Thrones, you can't say it's a classic because it has a lot of cultural relevancy, or in these opinions you can't. It doesn't count or merit as one. Instead, we'd have to wait around, see if it's still in print, see if people are still talking about it, if it's been analyzed for its themes, its messages, the way, it's written, the prose. That's basically about it. That's what we talked about in these past few minutes here. So what are my thoughts? What do I think? Obviously, this is my channel, so right now, we just kind of gave you like the very broad, if you like any of the ideas I presented here, for you to feel free, good Lord, to use them. And, when someone asks you what a classic is, you can be like, it's a classic because it's been around for a long time, and people enjoy it, and people talk about it, and it's in our cultural zeitgeist, and it has something to say, and blah, 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 blah. But really, what is a classic? I just mentioned it. It's when I think it's a classic when it has something to say. So obviously, I would hope you would understand this by now. I enjoy reading classics, so I can feel uppity and better than you. No, it's because they say something. They're interesting. They're cool. I have nothing against, run-of-the-mill fantasy. I used to read it all the time, and it was very fun, and I enjoyed it. But the thing with run-of-the-mill, like, pulp fiction books, like, I have a collection of, like, Hardy Boys books. They're, like, this thin, and you read through them, and it was a great story, and you're done. But what does it have to say? You know, not that the author intended it for something, for it to have something to say, but, like, what does it say anything at all? And nothing, really. It shows that these two guys are really good at figuring out detective problems, and sometimes there's a moral where it's like, oh, wow, when you work together, you get a lot of stuff done. Or sometimes when you ingest chemicals, you become a bad person or something like that. I don't it's been a while, okay? But that's not really saying something new. A classic for me has to say something new, something interesting, something I might have heard before, but it's done in a new way or brings it up in a new light. And it also has to be done through not necessarily beautiful prose. I wouldn't say all the classics I've read have been, written in a stylistically pleasing manner, because of course that's very subjective. For example, I did not or do not enjoy Dante's Inferno. Not really. It's fine, but I think I don't speak Italian, so I had to have an English translation. I don't know if my translation is the best, because when I bought it, I didn't really care about those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, no, was it very enjoyable for me to read? No, but I got what it was saying, and it was very interesting to me. So I think that's what a classic has to be. It has to say something new and interesting, and I believe it also has to have, cultural relevancy and stuff is nice, at least for me to be able to read it, because I'm never going to read, some book that no one's heard of, except for Camdra's Companion to Cicero, which has like 9 reviews on Goodreads, which I read, and it was pretty good. I give him credit. Good job, Catherine Steele. Yeah, that's what a classic is to me. It says something, and that's not a revelatory idea in the least, but it is what I believe, and it's my own insofar as I came up with it, which basically means I didn't read someone else's opinion on it, although I'm sure many other people agree with me. So let me know, do you agree on what a classic is? And if you don't agree with my interpretation, which is fine, we won't be friends anymore, which I hope is okay with you. It's not okay with me, but if you don't agree with me, let me know which of the other opinions you do agree with. And if you don't agree with me or the other opinions, let me know what your opinion is. If you have one, scoundrel. Let me make my finger bigger. Look at that. Focus. It won't focus because it's on manual focus. I don't think it is, actually. I don't know how to work a camera, but that's been all today. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. It wasn't a ramble because I did have like a bullet script down here, which you probably see me like look at. I don't know how clear the video is, actually. I've never, this is like kind of like the test image because I have a camera now, if I didn't already mention that. Anyways, I'll catch you later, brother. Adios.